Okay. And just for the recording, so I'll say I'm Terry Nichols with the Montana Watershed Coordination Council, and this webinar is just informational about the MWCC Watershed Fund's Big Sky Watershed Core Host Site Cost Share Support Grants. And they ultimately, I'll get more into it, but these are supporting the local capacity to improve water quality, generally through watershed restoration plan implementation. Just an overview of where we're going to head today. We've already done introductions. I'll give you an overview of the grant, including some of those eligibility questions, the review criteria, and I'll show everybody the application form. We'll talk a little bit about member reporting, because just to be clear, even though you will be applying for this grant, your member, if you receive the grant funding, your member will be doing the reporting as part of their professional development, and also one thing you don't have to do. And then I will share, there are a couple of other Big Sky Watershed Core cost share funding sources out there if this doesn't apply to you, or if you need more money than $7,500. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this funding, which is cost share funding, versus the Big Sky Watershed Core project support funding, which will be coming out next year. So just to create a distinction between those. And just so you all know, you're welcome to, it's a small group, chime in and ask questions anytime. I can actually see people's faces, so you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself if you've got kind of a clarifying question, and then we can do, you know, more in-depth Q&A at the end. And so just to clarify, because this applies to all kinds of things, MWCC, we are a nonprofit organization, and we get this funding in partnership with DEQ, which is a state agency. However, this funding is federal funding. So when you think about match funding, anything like that, it's just like the easiest to apply for federal funding that you will ever apply for, because we get to funnel it through the Watershed Fund. So it comes from Section 319 of the Federal Clean Water Act, comes from the EPA, and that's why you'll sometimes hear me referring to it as 319 funding. Yeah, and also the same source, again, when I talk about the Big Sky Watershed Core project support funding, it's the exact same source. It's basically, we have one contract with Montana DEQ that covers this cost share funding for Big Sky members, covers some project funds for Big Sky Watershed Core member-led projects. And then we also have some professional development funding that's more on a rolling basis that anyone can apply to, even if you're not hosting a Big Sky Watershed Core member. And I can answer questions about that at the end too. The purpose of this grant is to provide local watershed conservation organizations with resources to implement DEQ-accepted WRPs, and also apparently tribal WRPs as well, to reduce non-point source pollution. It's meant to increase that local capacity. You know, having a member can help recruit volunteers, do more education and outreach. A lot of members will do social media stuff and newsletters and just more things that get the word out. And so those are sort of the benefits to the host sites who are hosting members. And also, like on the member side, it's helping to build the next generation of Montana conservation leaders, allows young conservation professionals with less financial means the ability to serve as well. A few years ago, we were able to make this funding available not just for you all to pay that cost share, and that cost share is what you pay to the Montana Conservation Corps for hosting a member, so you can use all of it for that. But if you have the means, you can also use some of it to pay your member to help with their housing costs. And we don't ask you in the initial application if you're going to use it for housing costs, because we assume you probably don't know yet. But that is an option that if you receive funding, we can talk about that. You can use some or all of that award to help your member pay for housing costs. Any questions so far? Thanks for staying on camera, Peter. I appreciate having someone to look at. Not a requirement, but always nice. And so hopefully, you know, most of this is going to be just an overview of the request for proposals, so I'll go pretty fast. Hopefully you've all read the RFP, but $7,500 is the maximum award amount that you can receive. And estimated, MCC is still working on this, but they're estimating that the total cost share payment to host a member next year is going to be $15,500. It might go up or down by $500, but that's what they're looking at right now. Grant applications for this funding source, are due by 5 p.m. on Thursday, July 18th. The application to actually host a member, which is through MCC, right, which is different than this grant funding, that is going to come out later this summer, and that's typically due the first week of September. Brian said it's probably going to be the second week of September this year. So just be aware that that will be coming out separately. MWCC will be advertising that, so will MCC and the Montana Association of Conservation Districts will all be getting the word out. And so getting this funding does not guarantee that you will be able to host a member, but it gives you, because if you're working on these things and we're saying like, these are, really good activities, all these activities, your member does not, again, you can host a member who doesn't do anything to do with non-point source pollution. You can host a member for all kinds of natural resource. When we say Big Sky Watershed, like we mean peak to peak everything. Some members have very little to do with water. They might be working on invasive species. They might be working on all kinds of things, but you just wouldn't qualify for this funding, right? This funding is just for members who are going to be working on reducing and preventing non-point source pollution through a WRP. But just being aware that those two separate deadlines exist. Just because you get this funding doesn't mean you don't have to still apply for and receive the okay to host a member next year. Eligibility, and this is, Stephanie, I feel like Stephanie and Peter are both in a little bit of a gray area. Denise, I feel like your organization pretty clearly qualifies, but I think we have some wiggle room on all of these things. But essentially, to be eligible, you have to be applying to host a Big Sky member in 2025. That seems obvious. Again, working on non-point source issues through a watershed restoration plan, possibly also tribal watershed restoration plans. And your member is going to have to spend at least 25% of their service hours on those activities. It's just sort of a baseline. And the more time your member is going to spend, the more funding you're going to be eligible for generally. I mean, you can have your member only spending 25% of their time on non-point source activities. And again, that can be education and outreach, recruiting volunteers. We'll go through all that. But the more time they spend, the more likely we are to give you more money. If, it's generally competitive, and, if one member, because some host sites, it's like, my member is going to be working on nothing but non-point source pollution, they're probably going to get the $7,500. And if your member is only going to be spending 30% of their time, you'll probably get less. So just to say that. We've pretty much all gone over the first two on here, so I won't belabor those. But we do also, because MWCC's part in this is, right, we support collaborative, locally driven watershed conservation. And so just as a refresher, because I feel like this is getting old and a lot of the people who are involved in creating this aren't even here anymore. But on our website, we talk about the watershed approach to conservation, and these are the things, right? It's geographically focused, ensures broad community involvement and inclusion, community-based and community-driven, relies on local leadership, encourages collaboration, strives for consensus as opposed to litigation. And I think you all are doing that, but just to sort of say that is an additional criterion that we look at, is that watershed approach. Also, Megan, feel free to chime in with anything I miss. I forgot to say that.
Doing a great job.
And the qualifying activities, this is not an all-inclusive list. There may be other things you can think of, but it can be anything from actually, your member could actually be implementing projects for you. They could be planting vegetation and doing really on-the-ground things. They might be doing monitoring, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. And a lot of members work primarily or, majority of their time on education and outreach and volunteer recruitment activities, because that is one of those things that, members generally have the skills to do, and it's a place that they can fill in, fairly easily to provide capacity to your organization. A note on the maintenance and monitoring, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. The only monitoring activities, and this is where Megan will chime in if I get this wrong, but we get a little confusion on this every year. Members for this funding, to be funded by this funding, they can be doing post-restoration maintenance and monitoring, right? So you have existing restoration projects, they're looking at plant survival, they're doing photo points, they're like monitoring the success of those projects. They can also help with monitoring if you have a DEQ approved sampling and analysis plan. And maybe again, there's some tribal wiggle room, but you have to have an official sampling and analysis plan. Activities that don't qualify, is any monitoring that's not required by a sampling and analysis plan, or that isn't post-restoration monitoring. We definitely have groups who, they have another monitoring program that's not, in the, it doesn't have a sampling and analysis plan from DEQ, and has nothing, they're just doing some baseline monitoring. This funding can't cover those activities. Did I get that, Megan? Anything to add? Okay. And then also, this isn't an issue too much these days, but there are some older watershed restoration plans out there that have things that really aren't related to non-point source pollution in them. So if your watershed restoration plan happens to have, you're talking about carnivore monitoring or range riding, that's great that that's still in there, but that doesn't qualify because it's not related to non-point source pollution. A word about match funding. Hopefully you're aware that this funding does require a one-to-one non-federal match. Honestly, I have never had a Big Sky member have a problem with this because usually they're working with volunteers, they're working with partners. Host site staff time also counts for in-kind match, like your time working with the member can totally count as match. So usually they have like above and beyond plenty of match. So it's not something I would worry about. It can come from cash contributions too. They just have to be non-federal, and the in-kind has to be non-federal also. But it's worth noting here that, or do I have this in the next slide? Yes. The match has to apply to specific tasks. I've had a lot of people think like, okay, well, I'm getting $7,500 from this funding source, and then I have another grant that's going to pay for another $7,500 of my cost share, and so I'll just count that as match. And the way it works, but that could be paying for the member doing other things. We're looking for match that actually applies to the tasks and activities your member is doing, right? So if they're recruiting volunteers, you want those volunteers in kind time to be that match. If they are working on a project and you have some state funding or some non-federal funding, that can count as match. Also, people who are volunteering. And again, any of your time supervising that member, helping that member specifically with those activities that are paid for under this grant can count. But just to clarify that the match does need to be specific to these activities, not to their whole term and other things they're doing. Does that make sense, or does that not make sense to anyone? And then also just to say, like, it's fine. Like if you have 3 different tasks your member is working on, and we'll look at the application in a minute. I've seen some where it's like 2 of the tasks have 0 match, but 1 task has, enough match to cover them all. So not every task has to have match, just as long as you have enough to cover the one-to-one match overall. And before we get into the review criteria, I'm just going to jump to the actual application questions. Also, first, I'm going to show you, because I think people get confused on our website, just how to navigate to this funding source if you lose the link or something. But on our main page, just MWCC resources, funding opportunities. And then we always have the Watershed Fund grants broken out from other grants, right? Other grants is just anything that's not the MWCC Watershed Fund. So these are the Watershed Fund grants. So it's a lot of mousing over, right? A lot of hovering. And then you can see all the capacities. You can also click on this grant page and it'll bring you to all of them. But oops, I lost it. Funding. Big Sky Watershed Core support. And this page lists all the Big Sky Watershed Core support. So you can look at all the, you can also see previous sites that have been funded, previous projects that have been funded, all of that. But at the top, whenever we have an open request for proposals, it's always going to be at the top. And so then here is the request for proposals, as well as the registration for this webinar. I'll put the recording on this page too. And then you get to the request for proposals. And so just so you know, if you haven't caught it, because it's the very bottom, but you can download a Word version of this that includes all the application questions. So if you're the kind of person who wants to work from a Word document and then cut and paste in the online application, that's great. But you do have to apply through the online application in Submittable. And that's what I'm about to show you right now. And I'll go through this really briefly. It's pretty straightforward. And I feel like I do the instructions on each question kind of to death. So hopefully everything is self-explanatory, but your basic information. If you have a fiscal, one note is that, and all of your organizations should be fine on this, but for all of our grants now in Submittable, you do have to enter If you're a nonprofit, your EIN, your tax ID, and if you're a like this would apply to WMCC and Broadwater CD, like if you're a government sort of conservation district or any government affiliated entity, you're probably going to enter your UEI, which is your number for sam.gov. If you have a question about what that is, just ask and I can let you know, but it will make you plug in one of those government ID numbers just so we can see who your organization is. And if for some reason you're working with a fiscal sponsor, like if you're not the one who will be handling the grant funds, if it'll be a fiscal sponsor, you'll want to enter your fiscal sponsor's number instead of yours. But that's all on the Word version of this in on the RFP page. And oh yeah, I won't go through all these, but the main thing is you're basically filling out up to 5 tasks that your member would be working on. Again, all non-point source related, all WRP implementation related, and it's exactly the same format. You have to have at least 1 task. Most groups have 2. You do not have to have 5 tasks. Just think, as you're doing this, remember that this is the basis of your members reporting. Like if you get this funding, they will be reporting on this. So the more straightforward you can make it, if it's easier to have it broken down into 4 tasks, yeah, just do what makes sense and just make it streamlined. But yeah, just to say that there's room for 5 tasks, you only have to have 1. And so each task, give it a name. And then you do have to refer to your watershed restoration plan and tell us what, so we don't have to go digging, like, where is this in your watershed restoration plan? Just the page and section number. The percentage of your members' total service hours that will be spent on this task. It's an estimate. We're not, looking for precise numbers. We know it's a ways out. And then those activities. And so just a bulleted list is wonderful and easy for the reviewers and me to look at. That's great. And activities, I feel like probably all of you have written grants, but I just always like to say it because we always get it every year. An activity is something they're going to be doing. It's a verb. It's recruiting volunteers, planting willow stakes, working with the local schools to have more outreach in school. It's like a verb. It's something they will be doing. And then when you get to the deliverables, these are projects or numbers, right? They're going to write 5 newsletter articles. They're going to recruit 15 volunteers. They're going to host 4 events. They're going to table at 4 farmers markets. And sometimes it might be a report, some members maybe might do some kind of report. They're going to produce this report. Again, hopefully this is all self-explanatory in the instructions. And then non-federal match funding, just a reminder that it has to be non-federal. And as I just talked about, it just has to apply to the specific task. So that's why we break it down. What's your match going to be for this task? What's your match going to be for the next task? Again, we know that it is June, that these are due in July, and your members aren't even going to start until January. So we get that this is all ish. We get that these things will shift. Just put your best estimates of like, here's what I think. I think it's going to be all volunteer time that will be the match. But the more detail you can give here, again, the more you'll help your member with their reporting, because the member will be able to look. They actually won't look at this, and this is something you'll probably forget, but I'll say it anyway. If you do receive funding, we will, of course, write up a funding agreement, and there may be tweaks to this. We may say, actually, this one thing, this activity, we can't fund this, but we can fund something else. And so your final scope of work that goes in your funding agreement, that will be what the member reports on. Every year, there's a member who's like, oh my gosh, there's this task in my host site supervisor's proposal that I didn't even think I'm working on. And I was like, no, you're not working on it, because that's not the final funding agreement. So just make sure that if you remember, and I'll remind all the members that this proposal that you have won't be what they're reporting on, but it'll be the basis of the funding agreement scope of work, and that is what they'll be reporting on. So I'll be pulling, straight from this, cutting and pasting, and the more detail we have, the easier it'll be for your member and you to help them with what we're reporting on. And then the rest of the thing, it's exactly just task 2, same thing. Task 3, same thing. They're exactly the same. And then just to note that at the bottom, there are a couple extra questions. This letters of support, we've only had this a couple of times. Basically, if you expect your member to be working really closely with another Big Sky Watershed Corps member, with another host site organization, sometimes there's like crossover their report, especially if they both get the same funding. It's like they're both reporting on the same deliverables, and we just want to make sure that you're coordinating as host sites if you're going to have two members working closely together on something. So if you are going to have that situation, I'm happy to talk more about it one-on-one. But if you think that, you're going to be working closely with, like, WMC is going to be working closely with the Flathead Lakers and they're going to have a member too, we just like you to have a letter of support from them saying, yep, our members are going to be working together on these things. And we understand that we'll have to, like, parse out our grant reporting. And then these questions, this is, pretty in line with the purpose of the grant, just wanting to know overall, how is your member going to increase your organization's capacity to reduce non-point surface pollution, implement your watershed restoration plan, and then any additional benefits. You'll see that this question is not required because it doesn't have a little star, but it never hurts. It is a question that the reviewers look at. So it doesn't hurt to put, because we like to know, like, oh, well, they also will be working on something that's not related to non-point source pollution that's still going to improve watershed health. Does that all make sense? Okay. And then I'm going to show you the review criteria, which are pretty much right in line with that application form, right? Those, back. The member activities you're proposing are going to directly implement a WRP. Those qualifying activities I talked about earlier. The member activities will actually reduce and prevent non-point source pollution. And a note, I know a lot of members just are working on education and outreach. We know that's not a direct non-point source, but we recognize that that has impacts as well. So don't think that because your member is going to be doing all or mostly educational or outreach, that you're not going to get funding. Like, that's still, you just have to say, this is how it's going to, raise awareness, educate people more on the importance of water quality. And then, yeah, deliverables are reasonable. If you say our member is going to be recruiting volunteers, we don't expect you to say they're going to recruit 500 volunteers. That's probably not possible. Just make things reasonable and attainable and what might actually happen. Same thing with your non-federal match. We're not looking for you to have, if you have $30,000 in match, that's wonderful. Great. Maybe WMCC does. I don't know. but like, we don't need that, right? So just what is actually attainable for you guys to have, especially if it's going to be mostly in-kind match. And there's more. And this refers to those last couple of questions in the application. Just, we're looking to see that the member is going to increase your capacity. It doesn't say long-term, but we do kind of really mean long-term. Like, what are, like, obviously this year is going to be a benefit, but like, are there ways that your member is going to help you set you up to do more of this work in the future is always nice to hear. Again, those additional benefits to the organization. It is a ranked question. I think it's a 1 out of 5 instead of a 1 out of 10, but it's nice to share if there are additional benefits. And then that weird side thing where if you're coordinating with another host site, we just want to know how you're going to be doing that and have that letter of support or letters of support. Okay, and then if you get this funding, if you receive this funding, your member, again, will be doing the reporting. And this is sort of the timeline for that. We've been hosting a webinar for members on this reporting, which has been really helpful. Yeah, just outlining all of, like, here's what you're actually reporting on. You're also welcome to attend that because we do assume that you'll be helping them with their reporting since they wrote the grant. But it is primarily for members. And I'll send out that date like a week or so after they start. They all start in early January. So, and then May 29th, 2025 will be when their interim reports are due. November 6th, 2025, final reports due. That's like a week, 10 days before their term ends. So we have time to clean up any last minute things. If you want to see last year's reporting forms, or there's also an FAQ document that I have that I give to the members. If you'd like to see those, I'm happy to share them. They won't change a whole lot for this year, but just know that those will be available to your members too. Also, I did not say this. I think it's in the timeline. Yes. Okay. Just talking about, this is not reimbursement. This is actually an upfront payment. So again, funding proposals are due July 18th. We're going to be making funding decisions the week of August 12th. I'm on vacation the following week, so you will know something that week. And then the thing that's nice about this is, right, then you can apply to host a member, and we have this like pretty big lag time between when you actually need that money. because it's summer and we're, everybody's busy. So we generally don't get the funding. You'll get an email saying you have this funding, and also any questions, right? If there are things that the reviewers say, we can fund this, but we can't fund that, that sort of thing, I'll definitely talk with you about right off the bat. But I probably will not get you a funding agreement until, depending on what, hopefully September, maybe early October. But we'll work on those in the fall. And then the goal is to get those signed as soon as we can so that we can get you your payment in early December. So this is an upfront payment because the first cost share payment to the Montana Conservation Corps is always like it's right around I think it might be a couple days before the members start, but it's kind of that first week of January. And so we want to get you your funding in early December so that you have that on hand. You can make that first cost share payment because that's usually about half. That first payment is the largest. So we really just have to have those funding agreements signed by December 1st, but it's nice to get them done earlier. January 6th is the date that the Big Sky Watershed Corps member terms will begin. And then again, those grant report deadlines again. And so since this is not a reimbursement grant, they won't have to fill out any, budget forms or reimbursement forms or anything like that. It's just an upfront payment. Questions about this? Okay, we are flying through, which is great. Lots of time for Q&A. And then just so you're all aware, these are the other two primary, you might be able to work Big Sky Watershed Corps into other grants too, but in the state of Montana, these are the two sort of go-to, well, ours and these two are the go-tos. Montana Association of Conservation Districts always has funding. Their funding is through NRCS, so it's also federal funding, but it's not specifically tied to water quality. It's much more just general natural resource benefits, the things that NRCS cares about, working with more private landowners. And they do prioritize conservation districts for this funding, but sometimes other groups will get funded too. It's best to reach out to them. And this is the link I can, you know what, I'll drop this link in the chat. So you have it. And I actually reached out, Brenna, who manages their grants, has been sick for a couple of weeks. And so I wasn't able to get a hold of her, but this is the information from last year. It's usually around the same. And then the DNRC Watershed Management Grants, state funding, now has a category that's specifically up to $8,000 to host a Big Sky Watershed Corps member. And they're going to have another cycle opening in the late fall. So that's still possible to apply for funding for a member next year too, if you need that. And now the last bit, this is sort of a little tangent, but if you are planning to host a member next year who's working on non-point source pollution prevention and reduction, it's possible that you will also want them to work on a project, an actual on the ground project. And so we do have this separate funding, still through the Watershed Fund and DEQ, still federal EPA Clean Water Act funding, that is competitive, and it's only open to Big Sky Watershed Corps members. So it's really cool because it allows these members to, it's almost always the first grant they've ever applied for. They get to apply it themselves. It has to be a project that they're leading, right? Of course, you're going to help them with it because it's probably going to be their first project. But right, and it's usually something small. It's usually riparian revegetation or maybe a riparian fencing, grazing management plan with a local rancher, or yeah, right. Those are the two most common. We've seen members do low tech process-based restoration projects, putting in BDAs. It's usually something pretty simple because it's only $7,000. And also has to be doable within their terms, right? It's a very short turnaround. But just so you know, that request for proposals for that will open in February 2025. We always strive to have it happen like usually the week before their education, and they have a February training. And there's always a grant panel, and I usually sit on that. And so it's a good time to put that grant out, and then they can ask questions at that training. And they also get training on writing grants there. So just to be aware that will be a thing, because it's hard, if you are thinking of doing a project, it's hard to turn something around this quickly. So ideally, you would have something in mind, because it's pretty hard for the member to find a project and find somebody to work with and apply for something by late March when they start in early January. So just to keep it on your radar, and it does have to be a water body that's listed as impaired on the list of impaired waters. And I just remembered I was going to, I guess I may as well do this now while I'm thinking about it, but we were going to actually look at the watershed restoration page for DEQ, so you can see the plans, and I'll drop this in the chat too. Back. Okay. And so this link will take you right to the list of all the watershed restoration plans. So you can kind of go alphabetically and see if you have one like anyway, there's a couple that like WMC, there's several WRPs in your area, right? And you would just have to pick. I guess theoretically you could be working on more than one. You just have to have multiple pages and such, like however that, probably easier to focus on just one. But there are multiple. And then if you are a map person and it's easier, and then just talks more about what watershed restoration plans address and all that stuff. But you can go down to the maps here and the watershed plan viewer. More information about it. So yeah, it'll just show you where there are TMDLs, right? Which you have to have your TMDLs to have a WRP, but it'll just show you where all these plans are, and you can click on them and get to them from there. Yeah, sorry, these are the TM. Oh wait, do we have to click on? Hold on, it's been a while since I've been here. Sorry, this is the TMDLs, and then these are the watershed restoration plans within them.
You can also go to the layers in there, Terry, to turn off and on the areas and stuff. There's a lot of overlap and it's similar colors.
Got it. Yeah.
So I did that a lot.
There we go. That's what I was looking for. Thank you. So if you want to just see the WRPs, there we go. Thank you. Great. And then this is a lot of, I will send everybody to the slides along with the recording. This is also in the request for proposal, so I'm not going to belabor this, but basically just to say that this cost share funding that we're talking about today that you're considering applying for is to cover part of the cost share fee that you would pay to the Montana Conservation Corps for hosting your member. That's what it covers. So it essentially covers your member's time, right? They don't have an hourly rate, but more or less it's covering your ability to host them and have them work for you. The project support funding so the project support funding, right, is not going to pay for the member's time for various reasons, but mostly because we have this funding. But it's more for materials and equipment, travel, materials, and also your time. So the project support grants can actually pay for your time to an extent if you're going to be helping them, whereas this cost share funding does not pay for your time, but your time could be used as match. They can't match each other because they're both federal EPA funding. And then the project support funding, again, can't be used for members' time. The cost share funding, I just said this, pays for members' time, but the project support can't. And so the cost share funding can be used for applying for the grant. So, right, if you want to say in this cost share funding that, hey, part of what my member is going to be doing is applying for funding to get an on-the-ground project done. That's totally fine. But if this Watershed Fund, Big Sky Watershed Corps project support grant is one of the grants they're applying for, and they get it, then all their deliverables are going to be reported under that project grant. So basically, if you think your member might be doing an on-the-ground project, you're welcome to put that in this cost share and say, hey, like this might cover their time to apply for funding, to plan, to work with me on all these things. And it might cover them implementing this project too. But if the member applies for our separate project support funding, then they're going to want to put all the project, the number of willows they planted, the number of volunteers who worked on that project, just everything that's going to be reported under the project support grant. So to me, the easiest thing to do is if you think that's going to be the case, if you think your member's going to work on a project, put that into your activity. You can make that a task. You can put that under your activities. That's great. And they can still say, I did this. I worked on this project. However, all my deliverables are under the project support grant, because otherwise we have members who are reporting their deliverables for a project in this cost share funding grant and in the project support grant. It just gets confusing. So we can talk more about that if that actually happens to you. I think this is all the stuff that I just said. Yes, and it'll be in the slides that I'll send out. And that is pretty much it for me. So I know that we have some people who are like, I'm not sure if I qualify, so maybe it's the time to talk a little bit more about that.
I had a question about the WRPs. So, each of these is written with a sponsor who's made the plan really centered around their efforts of like, the Flathead Lakers will be doing this for Flathead Lake. So when we're talking about implementing these plans, is it that we're implementing like their exact detail of like it's their newsletters going out, it's their stuff, or would be like outreach to complement what they're doing? Is that involved under that umbrella of that plan?
I think I know the answer to this, but I think Megan's going to give you the answer.
Yeah, a good question, Stephanie. Yes, that's totally fine. It can be implementing the greater plan. A lot of times a certain tributary or an area might just even be mentioned in a WRP, and we consider that, hey, that's still part of it, because there's just no way for plans to cover every water body, right? So, anything you're doing in this greater basin is going to be fine to be covered under that Flathead WRP. Yeah. But if you have specific questions, like I'm happy to talk about that too, but you should be good to go.
Thank you. That clarifies a lot.
Yep.
Yeah. And I did want to just clarify with Megan too, because you mentioned just your eligibility generally as you are. So we don't, this funding, it says right in the RFP, this funding is not available to state agencies. However, in the past, we did fund Emily Henry when Emily was a Big Sky member, and she was working jointly with the Flathead Basin Commission and the city of Kalispell. And I think we just looked like it's tricky because you are a state attachment, but you're also sort of working in this more localized collaborative way that I think in general, we just say, yes, you qualify. And I don't know if Megan had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. If we feel like we need something to point to, I'm happy to come up with that. I think because just the nature of how you guys work, that's the intent, and I think anyone can understand.
Other questions? Peter, did you have, I don't know if it's more of a side conversation with you or we wanted to talk about tribal WRPs.
No, this is helpful. Yeah, as suspected, I think we're quite aligned with this funding opportunity at this time, but I'm very glad to have sat in and listened more to what this portion of the Big Sky Watershed Core program supports. Yeah, so, but I put it in my notes, so now I know if this comes up down the line, some places to go to talk for more information. So, right. Yeah, and it definitely, it's helpful too, is thinking about the deadline of September and kind of getting our brain moving around for what our application for a watershed core member may look like. So at the very least, you jump-started those synapses.
Great, good to hear. And also I should mention, I forgot, but it's usually Brian Wilson, but somebody from MCC always does a webinar as well for their applications, like for members or for host sites, potential host sites that have never applied to host a member before. So he'll do something that's more broadly on, like, he usually does 2 of them at different times, but it's like, what do you need to do to host a member? What, like the more general requirements that don't have anything to do with this.
And all the applications for a member go through MCC. None of them go through MWCC.
Yeah, we typically, MWCC and MACD typically like consult with them on the host. Like I will tell them, hey, these are the host sites that got funding and like, here's their work plans. And so like they're generally, but the applications do go through MCC. MCC hosts the AmeriCorps grant that funds the rest of the members' time. And then MWCC and MACD chime in on what host sites get chosen each year. So we do have a say in that. We do have some input in that, but MCC is generally in charge of the members and like placing the members with host sites.
Peter, I'm sorry, can you say again what organization you're from?
So,
Oh, you just muted yourself instead of unmuting.
sorry, there's a little bit of construction in the background. We're moving to a new office and they're changing some shelves here at this house where I'm at. I'm with Glacier 2 Medicine Alliance. We're a community-based conservation group in East Glacier.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then Denise, did you have any questions? I know it sounds like for you hosting a member is maybe more like 20
Down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it answers some questions though. So I feel better about kind of how it all goes together.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Great.
it was definitely worthwhile.
Okay, good. Glad to hear it. Okay. Well, unless we have any more questions.
Not here. Thank you very much, Terry, for putting this together and everybody for joining today.
Yeah, thanks guys. Thanks. Yeah, again, thanks for being here. So I didn't have to talk just to Megan. But I will send out the recording sometime later this week.